We continue together with our exploration of where wisdom can be found, the book of Proverbs. Mishle, we're now on chapter 6, and we're going to read through in the Hebrew and the English together and then reflect on some of the themes that we see here inside of this next chapter together. So we'll go around the Zoom room and share in the Hebrew and the English together. Okay, so welcome everyone. Chapter 6. B'ni im aravta l'recha, takata lezar kapecha. Morton.
My son, if you stood pledge for your neighbor, gave your handshake to a stranger,
Nokashta be'imrei ficha, nilkadata be'imrei ficha.
you've been ensnared by the words of your mouth, trapped by the words of your mouth.
עשה זאת אפוא בני והינצל, כי באת בכף רעך, לך התרפס ורחב רעך.
Do this then, my son, and escape, for you have fallen into your fellow's grasp. Go grovel and pester your neighbor.
אל תיתן שינה לעיניך ותנומה לאפפיך.
Give no sleep to your eyes, nor slumber to your eyelids.
הינצל כצבי מיד, כציפור מיד יכוש.
Escape like the gazelle from the hand of the hunter, and as a bird from the hand of the fowler.
Okay. Goldie. לך אל נמלה עצל, ראה דרכיך וחכם.
Go to the ant, you sluggard, see her ways and get wise.
אשר אין לה קצין
Do you
שוטר
hear
מושל.
me?
Yes.
For she has no chief, no taskmaster, nor ruler.
תכין בקיץ לחמה, אגרה בקציר מאכלה. Verse 8. I think we're losing you, Goldie. I'm going to ask Marion to continue. We seem to be losing you. So verse 8.
She readies her bread in the summer, stores her food in the harvest.
Ad matai atzel tishkav, matai takum.
How long, O sluggard, will you lie there? When will you arise out of your sleep?
Me'at shenot, me'at tnumot, me'at chibek, yadayim lishkov.
A little bit more sleep, a little slumber, a tad more lying with folded arms.
Uva kemahalech roshecha, mechasorecha keish magen.
And your poverty will come as a wayfarer, your want as an armed man.
Adam bli'ayel ish aven holech ikshut peh.
A worthless fellow, a man of iniquity, goes about with a crooked mouth.
Koretz be'einav molel beraglav more be'etzbaotav.
Winking his eyes, shuffling his feet, pointing with his fingers.
Tahapuchot belibo choresh ra bechol et, midyanim yishaleach.
Perversity is in his heart, plotting evil, ever sowing seeds of discord.
Okay, surely, al ken pitom yavo edo peta yishaver ve'ein marpeh, verse 15.
Therefore his ruin will come suddenly. All of a sudden he will be broken without remedy.
Shesh hine sana Adonai v'sheva to'avat nafsho.
6 things are there which the Lord hates, and 7 he utterly loathes.
Einaim ramot lashon shaker v'yadayim shofchot dam naki.
Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands shedding innocent blood.
Lev choresh machshavot aven raglaim maharot larutz lara'a.
A heart devising wicked designs, feet swift in running to evil.
Yafiach kezavim ed shaker u'mashaleach medanim ben achim.
A lying deposer, a false witness, sowing seeds of discord among brethren.
Netzor b'ni mitzvat avicha v'al titosh torat imecha.
Keep, my son, the commandments of your father, and forsake not the teaching of your mother.
Great. Bev 21. Kashrem al libecha tamid, andem al gargarotecha.
Bind them continually upon your heart, garland them round your neck.
V'hitalchecha tenache otach, b'shochbecha tishmor lecha v'hakitzota hi tisichecha.
When thou walk about, it shall guide you. When you lie down, it shall watch over you. And when wake, it shall talk with you.
Ki ner mitzvah v'torah or v'derech chaim tochechot musar.
For a command is a lamp, and the teaching is a light, and the way of life stern reproofs.
Lishmorcha me'eshet ra mi chelkat lashon nochriya.
To keep you from an evil woman, from the smooth tongue of a stranger woman,
Al tachmod yafia belivevacha, v'al tikachecha be'afafeha.
do not covet her beauty in your heart, neither let her captivate you through her eyelids.
Okay. Shirley 26. Ki ba'ad isha zona ad kikar lachem ve'eshet ish nefesh yikara tatzud.
For a harlot's price is no more than a loaf of bread, but the adulteress stalks a precious life.
Hayachte ish esh becheko ubegadav lo tesafrena.
Can a man take fire in his bosom without garments getting burned?
Im yahalech ish al hagechalim v'raglav lo techavena.
Can a man walk upon hot coals without his feet getting scorched?
Ken hava el eshet re'ehu lo yenakeh kol hanogea ba.
So who comes to bed with his neighbor's wife, whoever touches her shall not go unpunished.
Okay, and Marion 30. Lo yavuzu leganav ki yignov lamale nafsho ki yirav.
Let one not scorn the thief when he robs to fill his belly when he is hungry.
V'nimtza yishalem shivatayim et kol hon beito yiten.
If he be found out, he must pay sevenfold. All the wealth of his house he must give.
No ef isha chaser lev mashchit nafsho hu yaasena.
Who commits adultery with a woman is senseless, ruining his life. He that does it would destroy his own soul. I suppose that's ruining, not running.
Yeah, you're right. No, it's right. It's ruining. It's very good. Nega v'kalon yimtza v'cherpato lo timache.
Wounds and disgrace shall he find, and his shame shall not be wiped away.
Ki kina chamat gaver lo yamchmol beyom nakam.
For jealousy is the rage of a man. He shall show no pity on vengeance day.
Lo yisa pene kol kofer lo yove ki tarbe shochad.
He shall not regard any ransom, neither shall he rest content, though you offer large bribes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you everyone for participating. Let's take a look at the structure, the themes, as well as some of the new pieces of the puzzle that are emerging here in our curriculum. What are some of the things that you notice or you have questions about? And then we'll take it from there. I have a couple things that I'd like to share that I'm thinking about here as well, but I'll take your questions and comments first. So yes, Goldie and then Bev.
I noticed there's a can you hear me, Rabbi?
Mhm.
Rabbi, can you hear me? Because I'm having trouble, yeah. In verse 30 and 31, I'm a little bit puzzled, although there's a number of themes here. They introduce two sentences only that I'm trying to figure out. In verse 30, it says, let one not scorn the thief when he robs to fill his belly when he is hungry.
Mm-hmm.
And in the next verse, 31, it says, if he be found out, he must pay sevenfold all the wealth of his house he must give. And that only two sentences relating to this particular theme, which on one hand, it says, don't scorn the thief when he's hungry, like don't hold him in contempt. And in the other verse, it says he has to pay sevenfold all the wealth of his house. But if he's so poor that he has to rob to fill his belly, where is he going to get the money to pay for this?
Okay, that's an interesting observation. These two verses on the thief are strange, and
Yeah,
they deserve more reflection. I think they're supposed to provoke us a little bit
yeah.
because they seem incongruous, right? That's part of what you're pointing
Right,
to.
that's why, yeah. And it's only two sentences, and then they go back to another theme again.
Well, what's the theme that's surrounding the thief?
Basically, it's again, beware of your neighbors, strangers. They talk about, again, the adulteress, beware of the adulteress.
Right, so specifically,
and there's a
it's the
section here
dangers of
which I don't
adultery,
know.
right?
That's
It's
right.
specifically
Again,
concerned
beware
about
of,
adultery.
you know,
So there's a link here, it appears, between the thief that seems, as you point out in these two verses, to interrupt this disquisition on the dangers of adultery, which then resumes on verse 32. And there may be a connection here to fill his belly, literally his throat, his appetite, his inner drive when he hungers, and the prospect of impoverishment that's invoked in the next line. So let's play it out. The thief takes what doesn't belong to him because he is hungry, and perhaps a more elemental kind of an appetite or drive than the lust that impels the adulterer, who takes a woman who
I
is not
see.
his. So there's an analogy being drawn here in terms of theft
I
and
see.
adultery, and the likely consequence for the thief is being stripped of all that he possesses. Whereas, what is the fate of the adulterer according to what we're learning here?
Destroys his soul.
Ruin.
Ruin in terms of reputation and dignity, which means shame. Possible destitution, that is, if the husband demands damages, and even possibly death if the husband's jealous rage, which is spoken about here, the rage of man, turns lethal. So that is the way the analogy is trying to work here. And then by the time we get to verse 32, adultery with a woman obviously seems redundant, but the Hebrew here is trying to create a kind of balance in the meter of the actual verses. But it goes back to verses 24 through 26, which evokes the seductive married woman as a theme. So that's a very good point that you brought up, Goldie. Thanks for the question. Bevan Morton had a question or observation.
I'm struck by the negativity of this whole chapter, except for verses 22 through 23, where there's some, refocus. The son, keep your commands of your father and forsake. But everything else seems to be negative. Don't do this. Don't.
Well, 20, right. So 23 and 24. Is that what you're referring to?
20 to 23 inclusive.
Yes.
Everything
Right.
else.
And we've seen 20 already before, right?
Yes.
Mitzvat avicha and Torah timecha, before it was called Musar avicha and Torah timecha, but 20 is a little bit of a repetition. 21 we've seen as well to have reminders, and 22 again as a daily practice. 23 is an interesting verse that we may come back to, which we haven't seen yet, but is quoted extensively throughout Hasidic literature, as well as in rabbinic literature. The command is a lamp and the teaching is a light. That's something that it's a very powerful kind of image that connects mitzvah and Torah. And again, it's showing us that there is the source of light, and then there is also kind of an extension of light. So what's the source of light that is spoken about here? Verse
Torah.
23, the Torah, right? Or the teaching. But the
That's right.
Torah is the source of light, and every mitzvah is considered to be a lamp. And if you're trying to overcome darkness, temptation, adultery, thievery, you want to have as many lamps along the pathway through darkness as possible. So that's something that is important amidst the darkness and the negativity and the pessimism of all the temptations that are being described here, primarily adultery. And again, we think of the repetition of the focus of wisdom as the feminine, and that wisdom gone awry is the adulterous stranger woman, where wisdom goes astray. So, sorry, Morton, go ahead.
A couple of comments just to get back to the first section we were talking about. In 26, you see, I don't think the issue of the thief who is hungry is just totally isolated, because it goes back to 26.
How so?
Which is for a harlot's price is no more than a loaf of bread. If the thief is hungry, presumably is taking a loaf of bread, and this speaks to the issue of satisfying your hunger. And it almost says that it's, in a funny way, it's almost that, okay, that's all right. You know, if you have sexual desire, find yourself a harlot is practically what it's saying. Because he's saying that's the cost. It's a loaf of bread, but it's not the ruin that happens if you actually engage with a neighbor's wife. So
let's think about that for a second. I hear what you're saying. Let's take a step back and give it some more thought. So the expression here, a whore's price worth being a loaf of bread, is meant to be hyperbolic, right? Because it's supposed to make us also recall Genesis 38, where Tamar stipulates that a kid, right, a gedi, is more valuable than a loaf of bread as the price of her sexual favors. So here's what may be operating here as a possibility. If you want to fulfill sexual desire, you could get it from a harlot for mere pennies, whereas the real cost of fulfilling sexual desires with a married woman will be the destruction of your life.
right.
And so if I'm understanding, this is what I think you're pointing to, is that the teacher is not suggesting that the adulteress is a deliberate killer, but rather that her cheating on her spouse will bring down the murderous wrath of her husband, verses 34 and 35, upon her lover. So there is a cost to all these things, and some costs may seem less expensive than others, but there's always a cost. The question is just the degrees of the depravity, is what it feels like is being spoken of here. Is that what you're getting at?
Right, but I'm also getting at the point that the idea mentioning the loaf of bread in 26 is it's linked, I think, to the thief who is hungry, who robs because he's hungry, and says, "Don't scorn them." So it's almost as if there's an understanding of reasons for going astray, which brings me to another thing I was struck by, that in the first sections there seems to be very lack of understanding of the son who goes astray, and it's almost as a excuse me if I'm insulting anyone's political views. It's almost a right-wing attitude about people who are poor, and it's assigning blame to them for their lack of effort, their lack of initiative. So I saw that.
Oh, this is putting blame on the person who has desire?
It's putting blame. It's saying someone who is if for some reason you get ensnared by your neighbor, it's really your fault. If you're sleeping, you got to get up, you got to work hard, you have to you have to show initiative, you have to go out there and do and work. And so I was struck by the lack of understanding for people who cannot do that. Maybe
Okay,
I'm.
let me address that for a second. No, there's some as a context, and I'll go to Marion. There is a context we have to remember that the Proverbs appear to have uh, been disseminated during a time when, after the Davidic dynasty has collapsed, and
Mhm.
so on a local level, violence and theft seem to have run rampant in a community that's struggling to rebuild itself. In addition, the sense of accumulation of debt, which is spoken about in verses 1 through 5, accumulation of debt is considered to be a serious thing, particularly involving loan agreements with strangers. And so the father's dire warnings again reflects the high risk, high reward monetary system that's been put into place under the Persian governance. And then there's more crisis that emerges as well. We see it in the prophets that are contemporaneous, Haggai, Zechariah, Nehemiah, that there's the crisis of otherness in commerce as well as within relationships. So there's a real fear that, for example, guaranteeing a loan for someone other than as part of your immediate family or tribe was considered to be a moral threat, and it could lead to financial ruin. And there was also the fear of the potential destruction of the well-being of the family and the solidity of the community. So commerce, economics, and what we would call kind of a moral code of relationships. Those two are intertwined in terms of the intersubjectivity, because they both require relationships with others who may be outside the family or the tribe. And the last thing a wise person wants is to have to resort to surviving by any means necessary, which could compromise their dignity and their integrity if you've made an obligation that you can't fulfill to a guarantor or engaged in something like adultery. So there's an incredible amount of fear and anxiety because of all of the crumbling of the forms of society that people knew, and the implementation of the monetary system under Persian governance and taxation. So there's a lot of anxiety around that in terms of commerce, as well as in terms of the relationships and sexual morality. So you're touching on some of the anxieties that are operating here.
Yeah, so this is akin to Polonius's advice to his son in Hamlet: neither a lender nor a
What does
borrower.
he say? Right. Yeah, there's a real anxiety about that because we're moving from an agrarian economy and society now to something that is more about value being transferred and traded through a monetary system and taxation. And there's just anxiety because the times are changing and people don't know how to cope with that shift. It's a seismic shift. It's like the same kind of anxiety you can imagine. Like many of us on this Zoom room can probably remember the days before cell phones and the days after cell phones, or the days before email and after email, and just the anxiety that comes with the accelerated way of communicating, or let's say, e-transfers in Bitcom, like Bitcoin, in terms of how a monetary system can change. And if you don't know how to do an e-transfer, or you don't know how to use Bitcoin, then all of a sudden you're talking to your child or your grandchild who's saying to you, well, this is the way I want to pay for something, or I want to give somebody a loan through e-transfer or through Bitcoin, and you're going to be anxious about it. It's the same kind of shift in the paradigm of commerce, right? And the relationship with each other, just to use that analogy, that is giving people anxiety in the same way that kids today will be meeting up with potential mates through social media platforms that we're not familiar with or comfortable with. And that brings us also a sense of anxiety. We would have wanted to have a shadchan, in our tribe, introduce our child to someone else in the tribe. And now you have JDate or Tinder or whatever is going on. And that provokes a lot of anxiety because we don't understand these ways that the next generation are entering into commerce and relationships, and they're highly intertwined back then as well as now. So you're definitely picking up on that anxiety. So let me go to Marion, and then I want to talk about the ant, which no one's touched on yet.
It was,
I like ants.
yeah, it's interesting because I read it the opposite of what Morton was saying, but specifically because of the ant metaphor. Because,
So tell us how.
well, first of all, the ant is feminine, and I mean, we all know how ants.
Yeah, she's feminine, nemala. That's right. Okay.
And we all know how ants work. That they're the soldier ant. They all have sort of an egalitarian work ethic, where they all. But in this case, the way she's described, so she has no taskmaster and no chief. She's running from an internal drive of some kind of maternal instinct that is preparing the nest and preparing, making safe her life. But it's a communal effort as well, as it is. Each soldier is plodding on his own, but it's unconsciously communal. But I was wondering if there's some parallel between that and where it says there are 6 things that the Lord hates and 7 he utterly loathes. That and then later on, when you talk about not scorning the thief, that there's different kinds of ways that you can go astray, and some are not more permissible but more understandable. The thief is more understandable because he is hungry, whereas the adulterer, there is no excuse for the adultery. There is a type of desire and hunger, but that doesn't threaten your life. That's not hunger as in you're starving, kind of desire for food. And I was wondering that, so there's some things that the Lord hates and some things that he utterly loathes. So there's sort of a degree of, I don't know, I found that there's seems to be a parallel in here, that some of these things, when you transgress them and you do the wrong thing, it's life itself that is going to punish you.
Right.
And other things are a sense of retribution that God will not abide by. And there's 2 levels there. There's 2 different, at the end when he says you can't bribe him, there's certain things, there's no getting around that these things are sin he doesn't like.
Right. So if we go back to 16 through 19 for a moment, and we map out the 6 and the 7, let's just take a look at that for a moment. So the 6 things which are considered to be a to'eva, which are the language is the difference between hating and an abomination. To'eva is very strong language. So let's count out the 6 things and see what's the 7th that's the most abominable in God's eyes. So the 6 are haughty eyes, lying tongue, hand shedding innocent blood, heart devising wicked designs, feet running swiftly into evil, lying deposer and false witness are combined. And the 7th appears to be sowing seeds of discord amongst brethren. Right? So again, interpersonal relationships are extremely important, and also the way that one is acting in terms of moral conduct and comportment. All these things are about the way that the individual acts in terms of their integrity, their dignity, and their complicity. But ultimately, sowing seeds of discourse amongst your brethren, ben achim, is something that's abominable, because that leads to the dissolution of the social fabric of the family and the community. Shirley?
Well, it also led to the destruction of the Second Temple.
That's right. Right. A lot of these things, and in the first temple as well, right? So a lot of these things in the 6-fold in terms of behavior. Remember, what were the 3 things that led to the destruction of the first temple?
Division among the people.
That's the second temple.
There was, that's a discord.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's sinat chinam, senseless hatred amongst the people. The first temple was destroyed because of shvichut damim, shedding innocent blood. avodah zarah, idolatry, and gilui arayot, sexual impropriety. So that's something that's interesting for us to think about in terms of the behavior patterns and what leads to destruction, right? So that's something
Would you
for
say,
us to think about.
would you say that because of political things as well going on between the Israelites and countries like Assyria, there was a lot of political things happening as well?
Sure, sure. There's definitely power struggles. That's that's part of the challenge as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the ant for a moment that Marion brought up. I think it's interesting to look through all of Proverbs and see how many times we have these kinds of fables or moral lessons that we learn through animals. So go to the ant, you sluggard, see her ways and get wise, for she has no chief, no taskmaster, no ruler. She readies her bread in the summer and stores her food in the harvest. That sounds actually a lot like woman wisdom that we meet again in Proverbs 31. She actually fulfills this kind of diligent behavior. It specifically says that she is the one who readies the bread and stores her food. So that's already something that's interesting and worthy of further comparison. But I want to go on for a moment and look at the diligent labor. Okay, so the diligent labor that's illustrated by this wonder-provoking example of the ant is profiled here because it's meant to prevent the rapacious onslaught of poverty, right? If you're lazy, you'll become impoverished. And so it's not, in many ways, it's not simply in passing that mention is made of the ant being part of the community that maintains itself without a chief officer or ruler, but it's kind of a marvel, right? The colony somehow endures simply with each ant gathering for itself. But laziness is, by contrast, something that invites poverty, and laziness is likened to a military attack in verse 11. So even the graphic description of the scoundrel's um, speech and body language, the crooked discourse, the winking, the shuffling, the pointing, is rooted in this proclivity to provoke social conflict. And perhaps its most damaging form comes through unnecessary and false litigation. So, in short, what the father is trying to teach the child, or the sage who's trying to teach the disciple, is that instrumental or practical values are being profiled here as being important within the context of the community and the family and its well-being. And so the way of the ant is meant to teach us about the necessity of diligence, as well as provoking a sense of wonder over its ability to accomplish a task without being ridden by a taskmaster, right? There's a sense that community can be created cooperatively. And I think that that's a very powerful message, because there's the sense that the child is going to individuate and so will the disciple, and the sage or the parent is not always going to be there. So you have to inculcate a sense of cooperation that will live on after the supervisor is no longer there, right? Try to inculcate the moral voice within, so that this disciple or child can be a responsible member of the community. And that's actually really, really quite important. I think the focus on the ant raises a whole host of other interesting associations to think about. Remember that large ant colonies might consist of 500,000 ants. And it's interesting to think about the place of the human being as an individual, and how an individual can hold this sense of this embodiment of the community of the many against the one, and the challenges that might emerge in terms of one's own autonomy relative to the greater good of the group. Now, in Hasidic tradition, it's interesting that Baal Shem Tov, as well as his great-grandson Reb Nachman of Breslov, as well as many other mystics in the Jewish tradition, had affinities with animals. So they weren't just symbols, but they actually also were able to be quite sensitized to the souls of each of the animals in different kingdoms they would encounter, and they would always have a lesson to teach. But here, the Baal Shem Tov moves in a different direction and suggests that this part of the verse that reflects on why the ant is so important teaches us about the human being who is like an ant and who has no chief or taskmaster nor ruler, and says from this that there are actually two types of people. So remember, the way the ant is being described here in the pshat, the simple meaning of the verse, appears to be somewhat positive, but the Baal Shem Tov suggests that there are actually two types of people. And this is interesting. He makes it a little bit more complex. He says one personality type is wicked all their days, like the ant that does not acknowledge the grandeur of the blessed Creator. The second personality type is one who walks in the pathways of the blessed divine name of God, even if that person sometimes falls from their level. So the distinction that he's making here between the two different personality types is that the former lives in darkness without any illumination all the days of their life, while the latter cultivates inner strength and acknowledges their own shortcomings. And so their inclination for good overcomes the inclination for evil twice as strong as at the outset, which seems to suggest that the Baal Shem Tov is reading this by saying that the problem with the ant is that it has no ability to recognize that there is a chief, ruler, officer, or taskmaster, which he sees as being negative, as opposed to in the pshat of Proverbs, the teacher or the father is saying, actually, this is an important quality because it teaches about diligence, but there's no ultimate ruler. And the Baal Shem Tov is saying, which is in line with many of his teachings, that there needs to be a real understanding in life that there is a chief, there is a taskmaster, and there is a ruler. And there is a kind of process of hashgacha, of supervision that does take place in life. And if you lead your life without that kind of reverence or acknowledgement, it leads to a certain kind of behavior. And if you lead your life with it, it leads to other kinds of behavior. So he's not so positive here in this specific instance about the way that the ant moves through the world, insofar as there's no chief, taskmaster, or ruler. That having been said, the sense of camaraderie that exists between these disciples, and specifically between Hasidim, was very strong. And so the interconnective relationship and the cooperativeness that we see with ants actually does mimic elements of the fellowship of Hasidism. So I think it's kind of interesting to consider. Any other comments or reflections on the text that we've looked at today? Yes, I can't tell. Is that Morton or Bev?
It's Morton.
Morton. Yeah.
I just, you referred to the section in the middle, which is just, keep the commands, bind them continually on your heart and around your neck. This section is reminiscent of the Shema, of the paragraph in the Shema.
Deuteronomy 4, right. Right, and we've seen it being repeated now a couple times, right? This isn't the first time that we're seeing that reminder. And the question that we asked when we saw it before was whether or not this was in verse 21 and 22, reminiscent of Deuteronomy. Is this meant to be like the phylacteries of the tefillin, or is this more of a sense of a kind of an amulet, or is it really more symbolic? But the idea is that when you lie down and when you wake up, it's a very similar kind of language that's being used there in terms of trying to be able to remind ourselves and inscribe this within your heart and specifically around your The neck here, of course, Gargarotecha, was seen as being the source of, it's not just where you would hang a bracelet or an amulet or a necklace, but the neck is the site of, what's the name of the vein that goes through the neck here?
Carotid, I think.
Yeah, the carotid artery.
The carotid artery. It's one of the, I'm just blanking on the name of it now. It's escaping me, but it'll come back. But in Arabic, it's called the al-nafs, and in Hebrew, it's called the nefesh. So the nefesh is the seat of desire, and it's also considered to be the seat of vitality that is as close to you as your neck. And if that is if you're strangulated, it's because you're no longer able to breathe here. The neck passage is being cut off, but also if you're cut here, that leads to a quick end of your life. And so in antiquity, the idea is that this is where the seat of desire was right at this artery here at the neck. And the goal is that if you're going to put a garland around your neck, it's in order to be able to control desire. Desire was seen as the nefesh that we have spoken about before. Nefesh can mean soul, it can mean being, but it can also mean appetite. So this is the seat of the appetite in antiquity to be channeled and directed towards positive and good things.
Yeah, another thing this section does is it elevates your father's teaching and your mother's words and your father's words to the words of God, because it's true. Because the in Deuteronomy, what you're supposed to be doing is listening to God, and here it says listening to your parents. Of course, it's their teaching, which presumably are, but it's making it.
But there's a shift that's happening here that you're noticing. It's interesting between verse 20 and verse 23, where it used to be. Actually, no, it was Musar Avicha and Torah Timecha, but Torah Timecha is always there, the Torah of your mother, that then becomes clearly shifts into a kind of communal path, not just a family path. In verse 23, where it's the Torah that is the sign of light. So that's an interesting shift that you're noticing from verses 20 and 23, how we're shifting from the familial to the communal. And I think that's an important shift that's starting to take place already within the book of Proverbs itself. And we see that as Judaism continues to shift and to evolve, that there is that shift from the focus on the familial to the communal and its ensuing obligation, right? Because the language of mitzvah is now being used here as well. So that's an important shift to take note of. All right, so for next time, we're going to resume together. We're going to move to chapter 7 and take a look to see, as we're moving from character, the concern from character, to the shift that goes on in continually focusing in on character, and whether or not that will ultimately lead us to chapter 8, the shift from character to cosmos. But here, chapter 7 that we're going to look at next time may be a kind of an interlude in that process, and I'll make sure that we have a chance to send that out before we meet again next time. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and we'll resume